Hello there, welcome to How's Your Book. I'm Marcus,
I'm Cole.
and in this video we're going to talk about books that we finished.
I finished The Mill on the Floss, finally. And Marcus, maybe about a week ago?
Yeah, a little while ago I did finish John Marchmont's Legacy. So today we're going to talk about them. We might split it into two videos, or it might be the same video. We're not sure yet.
But you'll know.
Yeah. And now we're going to do battle via rock, paper, scissors to see who goes first.
Ready?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I feel like I always do paper. Do you always do scissors?
I don't think you do. I think.
All right, so I'm going first. You want to ask the titular question?
So how was your book?
Okay, so it was a little bit tricky. It took me a while to finish, and through long parts of it, I would say I would consider it a slog, if you will. And it was a challenge to get through. I had to often sort of convince myself to read it, Once I started reading, I would sometimes fall a little bit back into the prose and into the style where it had some of the qualities I like about George Eliot's writing from Middlemarch. But overall, I would say I didn't like it, which meant that it was difficult to actually finish. And Marcus can attest to this. When I actually finished it, I would say I felt wounded, I don't know, where it was just okay, I have made it through this, but
At what cost?
at what cost? And I knew that I wouldn't find the ending satisfying. The Oxford World Classics has it such that it's endnotes rather than footnotes, and I prefer footnotes, I think. And basically the notes begin right after the ending of the book, and so you don't really have any pages that give it space, and so the ending, there's real quick, this is not going to be a spoiler free review, I think, on either parts, right? I anticipate that maybe in our vlogs or sort of more general the state of October type postings, we might be a bit more vague, but I consider once you're in a review space, I think it's fair game to have some spoilers, but neither of us has read the other person's book, so I think we still kind of want to speak in general-ish terms. That way, if the other person does want to read it, we could still read it without knowing beat by beat what happens. But The Mill on the Floss does end with characters have died, and there's a sort of a final message or summary sort of relating to these characters, and so I had glimpsed that many times over and over again as I was looking for the notes, and I was like, oh. So I felt this coming, but I didn't know any of the events that happened right prior to that very last page, so it's maybe 120 words on the last page, and I was like, okay, I know about this. So last night I finished the book. I was disgruntled, traumatized, unhappy.
Having a bit of a crisis.
A little bit of a crisis, just, and then afterwards I sort of started to put together my notes and my thoughts for this review, and I've swung back around.
Oh, really?
Not completely, but I would say I do not like this book, but I think it's interesting.
Okay.
And I have cried a little bit thinking about it. Periodically, I just start crying a little.
When you were having the crisis yesterday, I tried to console you with, at least now you know that you don't, like any book just because it's by George Eliot.
I'm not a simp for George Eliot.
It's.
I kind of am. So for background, like we've mentioned previously on this channel, I read Middlemarch with my best friend, and it took a couple years. I don't know. We read it physically together, not, at the same rate or anything, but we had to physically be together, which was a kind of helpful process in a way, because it meant that we were processing each chapter together. And so even though George Eliot's writing is sometimes very dense and I know some people find it a little bit like not exactly patronizing, but like more dense than it needs to be for a narrative.
It insists upon itself.
Yeah, exactly. We because we were approaching it together, I think that helped a lot. And so I do like George Eliot's style. There were like a few chapters with Middlemarch where I found it a little bit more challenging here or there, depending on the context of what she was discussing and like how familiar I was with what was going on. Occasionally I had to like really slow down and be like, okay, what's happening? But I liked the characters of Middlemarch. I liked the themes of Middlemarch. I liked how she wrote things. I liked the scope of it. Kind of liked quite a lot of things about Middlemarch. So coming into The Mill on the Floss, I knew that it was an earlier publication, an earlier book. And I knew that it sort of focused a little bit more on a childhood. I knew that it had themes of education because it was one of the things that Hannah listed in her possible choices for her prompt, which was reading a book that talks about education somehow. And I knew that it was considered a sort of not quite semi-autobiographical book, but one that has like more direct references for George Eliot's life. So, for instance, the setting of a rural childhood is true in George Eliot's life as well. And then there's like an estrangement related to how a character semi-unintentionally flouts social conventions or like doesn't follow social conventions. And then that leads to a further estrangement within her family. And George Eliot was estranged from her family because of her partnership with George Henry Lewes, and didn't talk to them for like a really long time. The other thing I know about George Eliot in relation to The Mill on the Floss was that she started, or some of when she wrote it was around the same time as one of her siblings' death. One of her sisters, Chrissy, I believe, died around the same time that she was writing this. She also paused writing this and wrote The Lifted Veil, which we previously read. Yeah, so those are some of the context things that I knew about. But overall, I didn't have like a strong sense of like the plot or what happens. I did get an impression that some people seem to connect with the main character, Maggie Tulliver, in sort of like a slight self-insert type of way. Do you know what I mean? When like people who, you know, maybe they have like misunderstood childhoods where they have trouble connecting to people and being understood, but they like reading books and they like thinking about things, and so they find like connection to that type of character. I have like a sort of sense that like that sometimes is something that like connects for people in The Mill on the Floss, but I didn't realize how much I would struggle with the text because I didn't find any characters really to connect with. I didn't really connect with the circumstances or the outcomes. Do you know what I mean? So like, I didn't like what happened. And so it's sort of a frustrating book in that way. Whereas like there's some books that might be challenging at times, but you do like what's happening and what comes to pass. I would say consistently throughout the book, I found everything a bit frustrating. And I think it's intended to be frustrating. I think I think it's intended to be an uncomfortable book. So one of the things in particular that I think could be interesting is that whereas Middlemarch focuses a lot on adulthood and sort of also the themes of like marriage and coming into like an adult relationship, The Mill on the Floss, for quite a considerable period of time, focuses on childhood, and the main characters don't get very old. So if we like look at the book, so for my edition, this amount is childhood set. So it's quite a lot. And then the transition to adulthood is very sudden, and it's based on a sort of tragedy that's going on in the family where one of the parents, well, the father, is stricken, paralyzed, no longer really able to be forceful figure within the family's life. So it goes from like so much childhood and like education and like what's going on with the children characters to suddenly kind of like they're very abruptly shoved into a parentified type role, where Tom Tulliver, the brother, is having to suddenly like provide in a way or like figure out solutions to provide, and Maggie Tulliver is sort of put in this sort of like empty space, kind of like she's able to like provide for her father and take care of her father, but her progression as a person doesn't really go anywhere anymore, because of like the restrictions of the circumstances and like sort of this emergency situation. I think I struggled with this childhood stuff in part because I'm an only child, and siblings, the relationship between Maggie and her brother Tom, well, some readers kind of like I saw some things that made it sound a little bit more idyllic than it actually is. It's really tense. Like he's an older brother, and it's constantly this tension of Tom sort of like rejecting Maggie and like disliking her, and her being a problem, her being difficult, her being unwieldy, her being like violent in some ways, irrational, this like sort of wild feeling creature. Benji? Oh no! Benji wants to be on his bed. You want to show? Yeah. Okay, really jiggly. Benji. Okay, we'll see how that goes. So, do you want to pick him up or something? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, like I found Tom a really frustrating character, and it felt like there wasn't any respite, where there's no place where like Maggie's really like seen and appreciated. It's just this like constant rejection from her mom and from Tom and kind of from her father, though he has a little bit more of an appreciation for her. Yeah, so throughout her childhood, she's really denied everything. Like, it's a lot of denial in her childhood. She doesn't really get like a childhood with affection or like love, really. And then suddenly there's this parentification type thing. And so it's kind of grim. Maggie also, like I said, is sort of this intense character. There's when she's a child, she sometimes when she's frustrated goes upstairs into an attic, and she has a little doll that she like thwacks on things and like stabs and stuff. Wow. And like there's a scene where somebody says something about her hair, and she's like tired of like this sort of how people talk to her about her physical appearance and like her body, and she cuts off her hair, and then she's a little gremlin running around, and she shoves her little cousin into some mud and stuff like that. Like, she's a little bit of a wild creature. So and that's kind of where I ended up getting a little bit teary-eyed later thinking about the book and doing some like research into interpretation and criticism. So Maggie is a difficult character, and I think the thing that's ultimately unsatisfying about the novel is that like it doesn't reach a resolution point. Like things don't really get better. And in her adulthood, the experiences that she has as a child, including sort of like the denial and like the rejection, they kind of get played out in her relationships with these two different men in her life, including one whose name is Philip, and he is he's the son of her father's like enemy, like in a really big dramatic way, and the other person is a more sort of privileged member of the small town society who her cousin Lucy has a bit of a connection with. And neither of these are really viable options for Maggie in terms of a romantic partner, because of like the former is her father's like enemy's son, and so there's no connection really that can be there. That's sort of like a immovable obstacle. And then the other one, it's not really a realistic option because of the pre-existing connection with her cousin Lucy, right? And so there are more sort of ways in which she kind of expresses her longing to experience another feeling, you know? And so like with Philip, we see her having this longing to experience a type of intellectual, emotional feeling that's sort of like, you know, reading books and talking about books and thinking about things, and like sort of like this more expanding of her mind. And then with Stephen, there's a little bit more of a sort of infatuation element to it, where it's like these romantic feelings, and like he's singing and she's like, oh my god, you know, and stuff like that. But there are ways for her to experience these feelings rather than to experience like actual kind of like emotional and like social safety. Like there's nothing safe and good there, you know? And the estrangement with her brother just sort of like deepens throughout the novel. And then the ending, which is something that a lot of people have issues with, is very abrupt. Like we're sort of like experiencing this sort of interior reflection and a little bit of prayer and stuff like that, and her thinking about her circumstances, and then all of a sudden this sort of act of God, otherworldly event happens, and then we're switched to how she's navigating that thing. Spoiler-ish. It's a flood. A flood happens, and so suddenly she's like in this sort of introspective mode, and then very quickly switch to this having to react to this flood, and then it's maybe like 5 pages at most or something of that happening, and then more spoilers, she dies, right? So it almost feels like this shift into another genre, and I think that effect is really destabilizing for a reader, where you kind of think like this is happening and what's going on here, and you're like bopping around, and then all of a sudden you go into this like really dramatic kind of gothic intense thing, and then they die, you know, and so there's no resolution, and I think it's interesting once you kind of get over that initial sort of rejecting shock, because it does create a finality, you know, like there is like a sense of resolution, there's a sense of destruction, but it's ultimately really unsatisfying, because you have this sad childhood where there's a yearning for connection amidst sort of this like violent sort of incoherent rage that she feels, you know, and then she doesn't understand, and then she grows up a little bit, has a couple of experiences, and then she dies. Do you know what I mean? So it's really sad, and I think in contrast, like Middlemarch has sadness, but it's not like defined by sadness. So I think I really struggled with that. I think, you know, there's not really much hope to grab onto. It feels like a cautionary tale. It feels like it's playing around with like format a little bit and like tropes. One of the articles that I found that I will provide discusses it in terms of a Bildungsroman, and sort of like dual stories of Tom Tulliver's Bildungsroman type story and Maggie's sort of more gothic type story, and then sort of how the book is sort of like a inversion and also a critique of these ideas. I'll provide that one, or Marcus can put in like the credits for like that article here. But ultimately, I think I did not enjoy The Mill on the Floss. I think it sometimes you have moments where you're like, ooh, George Eliot, you're so funny with the writing. You still have that like you do in Middlemarch. But it is a bummer. And I think it is maybe a more interesting piece of literature insofar as how it like challenges the reader, makes the reader uncomfortable, you know, and what that maybe also means when you think about it in terms of George Eliot's personal life. You know, she didn't really, is my sense, she didn't really get a satisfying ending when it comes to like her family. And I think the main thing that the book evokes for me is the frustration of being like unwieldy, difficult, misunderstood child, in this sense of a young girl who isn't understood, isn't appreciated, is unruly, wild, and doesn't have any opportunity to go through an adolescent and develop into something else. Do you know what I mean? Or like to grow. It's just sort of like this arrested development and like this intensity of a feeling that has no space to be processed, that there's no safety, and so it becomes like explosive and destructive. And so it's kind of a fleeting bummer. Oh, also, I'm sure other people have made this comparison before, but it did make me think about Jane Eyre, which Marcus knows nothing really about, and so I won't really say too much about it, other than in Jane Eyre there's a bleak childhood and there is a more satisfying outcome. So I was sort of struck by it makes me want to read Jane Eyre maybe where like something is okay. You know. Yeah, so any questions?
Well, it's interesting to think like how your recollection of it will be over time, if it'll mature over time.
I think it might be more tolerable on a second read. Yeah, I think I expected one thing and it was like nope. And so it was ultimately frustrating, and there's not much to cling to, but I think that's like by design, you know. I think probably it does seem like George Eliot thinks that there's like a little bit more of a nice connection between Tom Tulliver and Maggie. There's a couple of lines where she sort of says like, as we have seen, you know, blah blah blah, and I'm like, have we seen this, George Eliot? Have we seen that they have a nice little connection? But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's certainly a really good novel for Hannah's Challenge, where it explores education, both in terms of a formal education where like Tom is sent to learn. His father pays for him to go to like a little bit like of a tutoring type scenario, and where Maggie's complete like lack of education really underserves her, you know. In part like because like she's not even getting anything really at home either. Yeah, so it also works for of course Roz's empire spotting. I think there are some interesting things where Tom Tulliver is looking for a role in the world and like looking for jobs and stuff like that, and you see some intersections with like importing goods and like that sort of like growing world type of thing, and like STEAM and stuff like that. There's not really that much in terms of friendship. There's a little bit. There is a bit of a change in class status, where the Tullivers are a little bit more working class, okay, and then that goes whoop all the way down. Yeah, it's an interesting book, but I would hesitate to recommend it. I kind of wish that I went into it knowing more about it, like that I'd like read some articles or something like that. Yeah. So
would you call it a provincial novel in the way Middlemarch is? Is this more or less like about a community, or more narrow in its focus?
I would say it's more narrow because it's more about a family. So whereas Middlemarch has like this nice sort of like scope and like stretch where you get like a bunch of different people, like your map of characters is going to be pretty big. In the Mill on the Floss, we're sticking with the Tullivers, and we get like a couple other ancillary characters, but primarily we are with Tom and Maggie. And we get a little bit of like their paternal family, just a little bit, and we get a bit more of their maternal family, which has several aunts and uncles, and so there's like some interest there. So, but it's much tighter than Middlemarch, and I think that's where some of like the lack of satisfaction comes in. Whereas like in Middlemarch, you have these different corners and these different things going on, and you can feel like you may feel desolation in one area, you feel a little bit of uplift over here somewhere else. With this, it's like very like it's all bad, baby.
Middlemarch, of course, like, you know, has like a very social realist strain for much of it, and towards the end becomes a bit more classically novelistic and a little bit more of a novel of incident than a novel of character.
Yeah.
Is there a similar, would you say there's any like similar shift in this? Is this like, you know, would you describe this also as a social realist work?
I think one of the things that I read that I will try to reference. So Nina Auerbach wrote, I think it's a book chapter called Demonism and Maggie Tulliver, which is really interesting, and I strongly recommend it. And it's really like pulling out sort of like the gothic within the novel. So it does have elements of like realism, but with sort of like a perspective twist to it. So this is a quote from the chapter where she first is referencing how early on in the book, the stolid world of the Mill on the Floss is more receptive to the uncanny than its surface appears to be. It is true that Maggie's pull on the novel causes George Eliot to relinquish her sharply defined moral perspective in favor of a sense of immediate immersion in the depths of in life, a loss of perspective that is in many ways a gain, as the author herself seems to realize, for she begins the novel by abandoning herself to her material in a refusal to be our sage. And then at one point, Maggie sort of mimics these ducks, and she dunks her head into a basin of water. This is when she's like a child, very young child, in the vindictive determination that there should be no more chance of curls that day. Throughout like the early scenes, like they're criticizing her on her appearance and her hair. The repetition of this gesture suggests an important area of experience in the novel, one that the narrator leans towards herself. Plunging one's head underwater entails the exchange of a clear vision for a swimming vision, a submergence in experience at the cost of objectivity and judgment. Maggie Tulliver lives in such a swimming perspective, and The Mill on the Floss is her story. Though many critics find loss of perspective to be the besetting artistic sin of The Mill on the Floss, the experience of perspectivelessness is in part what the novel is about. In one of its many nostalgic evocations, it defines childhood vision as the strangely perspectiveless conception of life that gave the bitterness its intensity, admonishing us that if we could recapture this intense vision, we should not poo-poo the griefs of our children. But it is part of Maggie's nature that, like Peter Pan, she never goes away from her capacity to plunge into the moment, to submerge herself exclusively in what is near. That's like, again, I'm starting to tear up a little bit because it never has a chance to really develop into this adult sense. So like you do still have some of like that realistic style, and that like is really nice in Middlemarch, but it's much more immature and like grounded in like a childishness, you know. And then you have like these spikes of like gothic things happening, kind of like where it's like, oh my god, you know, like, and like really yikes. Yeah.
So I take it this has, yes, I think so. I take it this has less of the God's eye view of George Eliot in Middlemarch.
It has a little bit, but I think not as much.
Interesting.
And like you get it at times, and like a little bit like commentary here on the side, but I would say less. That's less the impression you get throughout. You still have some of like the kind of like tropes of George Eliot style, but less grand, I think, maybe. Yeah. It's a different sense, or like different experience reading.
Did you feel that these characters were harder to understand psychologically than the characters in Middlemarch? I think the characters in Middlemarch they seem to have very profound, drawn out psychological profiles. You get this impression. Is it that the characters in this book are harder to penetrate? Like,
I'm tearing up again. So, no, they're not harder to penetrate. I would say you have like a very strong sense of them. I think and you have a very good sense of their frustrations. So, for instance, you have a lot of the books around kind of like the mistakes of the father and mother in the Tulliver family, and as the two children are sort of like thrust forward into this parentified type role very early on when they're like 16 or something like that, you have Tom Tulliver, the son, who is feeling this responsibility and this like need to kind of step up, but he's also feeling like a rejection towards his father for like his mistakes and stuff. So he's got like this judgment towards his dad where he's like, and you have a very like good sort of portrait of like what's going on with Maggie. So like I think it's richly drawn, and you have lots of insight. I think it's a little bit weaker in a couple of spots. It's a little bit less richly drawn for some characters, but overall I think good. Yeah, in some, I would say I didn't really enjoy the reading experience on the Mill on the Floss, but I think it is an example, sort of like what I brought up before, when you feel like uncomfortable or when you feel disengaged with an author or a text rather, I think it can be helpful to start to explore why. And I found it very helpful to like read some other criticism and articles related to it or book chapters to start thinking a little bit more about what might be going on that evoked that feeling for me. So I think it's hard and sad and frustrating to be in the space of a difficult childhood with no positive outcome, and then to have that very sharply end without any resolution, not really much goodness. And so I think it's a very discomforting book. So it's interesting. I don't always like to rank books, but I think it's an interesting book in how it can provoke, rather than provide enjoyment. Yeah. So, yeah. Recommend it with like caveats. I don't know if I would recommend it exactly, but it's I don't love it. Yeah. So, all right. So that's my review. I started reading Jill by Amy Dwivlin. So that will be my next up.